going to present our November 2019 fiscal assessment report based on the budget that the government presented back at the start of October. So just setting out the context in which the council operates, initially established back in July 2011 and set on a formal legislative basis with the fiscal assessment, or with the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2012. Our makeup is that we have a 5-member council and a 7-member secretariat, and the main publications we have are the twice yearly fiscal assessment reports, one in April based on the Stability Programme update, and the second one in November, with other publications throughout the year in terms of assessment of fiscal rules and also a pre-budget statement, among others. Our mandate itself has 4 elements. So prior to the budget, we have endorsed the macroeconomic forecasts that went into the budget and also into the Stability Programme update. Then in our fiscal assessment reports, we'll assess those forecasts, we'll monitor the fiscal rules, and we'll give our opinion on the government's proposed fiscal stance as set out in the documents it is publishing. So just turning to this report and the assessment of the broader economic environment in which the budget was set, the economy continues to perform very strongly. So given some of the issues with measurement in the Irish economy, our focus could be on the labour market, and we're still seeing very strong labour market figures. The most recent labour force survey showing employment is still growing at around 3% and has been growing at that pace for quite a sustained period. There is now a greater composition between full-time and part-time workers. Going back 12, 18, 24 months ago, a lot of the growth would have been in full-time employment. In fact, full-time employment would have been growing faster than part-time, maybe as part-time workers transferred to full-time positions. But now we're seeing growth across both types of employment, and that's reflected then in a significant drop in the unemployment rate, and the most recent figures probably have us back to pre-crisis levels, approaching what could be termed maybe full employment, with the CSO currently putting the unemployment rate just below 5%, and maybe we're beginning to see the impact of that when it comes to wage pressures in the labour market. The CSO this week had their quarterly wage data out, with nominal wages growing at around 4%. So maybe the pressures in the labour market are beginning to show through increases in wages. In terms of the context in which the budget was set, we sort of have to think back to 2 months ago. We can't put today's cap on, given what we know and sort of the rapidly changing environment, particularly across the water. And there is a number of scenarios that were possible at the time. So one scenario, if we just take 2018 to be a starting position of 100, that you just have a continuation of the very strong growth we've had for the last number of years. In the previous document, the Department of Finance suggested that a soft Brexit would lead to some form of a slowdown, that there would be an impact on the Irish economy, and the assumption back then was of a central scenario of an agreed or soft Brexit through some form of withdrawal agreement. And of course now that withdrawal agreement has changed, and even maybe the implications of that have changed, particularly at the end of the transition period. When it came to looking at Brexit itself, of course, the risks of a no-deal Brexit were higher at the time, perhaps, and the central bank had a more adverse, disorderly Brexit scenario, where you had close to a zero growth rate for 2020, and then a gradual return to growth in 2021, but a significant gap in terms of the overall levels of output or economic activity. And if you look at where the government put their disorderly Brexit scenario for budget 2020, it's possibly somewhere between the two. So yes, it is worse than the soft Brexit scenario they had in April, but maybe not as adverse as some of the estimates of the impact of a possible hard Brexit could have on the Irish economy. But again, a significant gap between this upside scenario, which still remains a possibility, and the scenario in which budget 2020 was framed. So we had 2 sets of macroeconomic forecasts in the budget. One was an orderly scenario and the second was the disorderly scenario, and there is quite a range between them. So the budget was set in sort of an environment of unusual uncertainty, in terms of that there was different things that could happen, and they have very different implications from a macroeconomic and then maybe a fiscal policy perspective. Although the economic indicators point in a positive direction, from a fiscal perspective, we're still carrying a significantly higher debt than most OECD countries. And if you look at our net debt ratio, which is looking at the gross amount of debts, then offsetting some financial assets, which the government does have, significant cash reserves that wouldn't have to be borrowed again, and perhaps bring our net debt ratio down. And if you use a more appropriate denominator, so we all know the problems with GDP, so we'll use GNI star. Ireland's debt ratio in OECD terms remains the 6th highest in the OECD. So even though significant improvements have been made with the public finances, the 200 billion debt does remain and is a potential drag on the ability of the state to draw in additional financing if so required. And when we look at the ongoing balance on an annual basis, we see that while significant improvement was made up to 2015, since 2015 those improvements have stopped. Not slowed, have stopped, so that the primary balance, so the government balance excluding interest payments, improves right up to 2014 to 2015, and then is unchanged since then, so through 2017, 18 and 19. So even though there has been significant tailwinds behind the public finances, if we just look at the primary balance, overall spending excluding revenue, or sorry, overall spending excluding interest relative to revenue, and the gap between those has by and large remained unchanged. And if there was to be an orderly Brexit agreed at the start of the year, it's estimated that will continue into 2020. We can begin to see maybe the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the government's fiscal position. In 2020 there'd be a slowdown in revenue growth. It wouldn't match the growth of recent years, and there would be some additional spending due to the no-deal Brexit outcome, and that results in a deterioration in the primary balance of about 1.5 percentage points of GNI star, somewhere in the region of 3 billion of deterioration relative to an orderly outcome versus the disorderly outcome. But the key here is that even though the economy has been performing very strongly, the government itself has been getting significant boosts, particularly on the revenue side as we go through. The primary balance has been unchanged. All those gains have been used and used to as quickly as they've been coming in. And if you look at the revisions, so that looks at the primary balance from 2015 on, things have changed over that period. And in consecutive publications, whether it's the budget or stability programme update, we're seeing revisions on both sides. So first of all, we have the revisions to primary spending. So all spending excluding interest, and the darker lines are the more recent. So you can see the forecast going back 3-4 years, and as they become more and more recent, they're getting higher and higher. So spending is continually being revised up, some of it through the budgetary process, and a large part of it, as we'll see, through unplanned or supplementary estimates within each year. But while this spending has been revised up, equally of course on the other side, there have been changes to revenue. And we see a pretty similar pattern when it comes to the department's revenue forecasts. The darker lines are the more recent, and they're also getting higher and higher. So on both sides of the equation, we've increases. Spending has been revised up, and revised up quite significantly. Like these are units of 5 billions, so you're looking at very significant rises. But you also have significant rises on the revenue side. When we combine them and see what's happening to the balance, we see that the darker, more recent outcomes are towards the bottom. So it was predicted that the balance would be higher, and now the forecasts of the balance are getting lower and lower. So the revisions to spending are faster than the revisions to revenue. So the predicted high balances of a couple of years ago haven't materialised. In fact, if the hard Brexit scenario materialises, we'll be much, much lower. But the darker lines reflect more recent outcomes. So higher for both spending and revenue, and the darker lines are lower down for the balance. So that the spending revisions have been greater than the revenue revisions over the last number of years. And if you look at the nature of the increases, the government and the Minister of Finance put a certain amount of emphasis on the way capital spending has been rising over recent years. But if you look at the changes that have happened relative to what they set out in Budget 2017, most of the revisions have happened on the current spending side. Yes, capital is now a bit higher, but in terms of scale, the largest increases have been on current or day-to-day spending, staff, transfers, use of goods and services, etc. And that's where most of the increases have been. So relative to what they set out for Budget 2017, current spending is 4.5 billion higher, capital spending 1.5 billion higher, and they have the benefits of lower interest, which is just over €1 billion lower than what was set out at the time. But although the focus might be on the capital, the largest changes have been on the current side, with rises there. And if you look at the impact of these changes on our fiscal framework, looking at the fiscal rules and what the assessment is, we'll take two components of the fiscal rules. One being the spending rule, try to keep the growth rate of spending within limits set by the medium-term potential growth of the economy, and then look at the structural deficit rule. Look at your balance, stripping out the impact of the economic cycle. So first we have the Commission's assessment, and the Commission's assessment is in terms of being compliant, some deviation, or significant deviation, and we can see for recent years the Commission had not been given a clean bill of health, some deviation in both 2016 and 2017, and then for 2018 both rules being breached through largely unplanned increases in spending and spending growth beyond what could be sustained by the economy. The Commission's assessment for Budget 19 and 20 came out recently, and in both years they're suggesting that the plans as set out are compliant. Now we've taken a different approach to assessing the fiscal rules than that taken by the European Commission. The European Commission have a common approach across all member states to which this applies, and of course a lot of their assessment is based on GDP as the denominator, which may lead to issues. And also the European Commission apply a common approach to estimating the impact of the cycle. How do they get to that structural balance? And they have a commonly agreed approach across all countries, which both the Fiscal Council and the Department of Finance have said is not suitable for Ireland. So our approach is based on alternatives produced by the Department of Finance and endorsed by the Fiscal Council. So if you look at our principles-based approach, what would be more appropriate from an Irish perspective? Perhaps we're getting a different picture than what the Commission are suggesting. But most notably in terms of the spending rule, we're going from being compliant in 2016 to having a breach in 2017 to having a significant breach in 2018. So there has been a deterioration in compliance with the spending rule, spending growing above what the sustainable or medium-term potential growth of the economy would indicate in each of the last 3 years, and that got progressively worse up to 2018. When it comes to the structural deficit, we show compliance in all years. Now, one issue with this is that it is very much based on counting in total the corporation tax receipts that the government is receiving. So they are boosting the budgetary position, and if a certain amount of those were counted as excess, that would limit the compliance with the structural deficit rule. So although the receipts are being received, there may be issues in terms of their long-term sustainability, and that's probably been undermined by the rate at which spending is growing. For 19 and 20, we're showing compliance with both the spending rule and the structural deficit rule, but as we'll see, we have concerns about the figures on which these assessments are based, not only for 2020 when the budget is set, but equally for this year, although we are already in month 11. And in terms of just the sort of boost that the fiscal position has been getting from these tailwinds, reflecting the concerns we have about the lack of improvement in the primary balance. The ongoing cyclical recovery has led to a reduction in government spending, of course on unemployment benefits, and more economic activity, and economic activity growing at a rate that to be above trend. There's been a boost to cyclical revenues, income tax, VAT, etc., growing at rates would be above their trend. Outside of the primary balance, the government has benefited from reduced interest costs. The interest rate of the national debt continues to fall. and rather than heading towards 10 billion, our annual interest bill is heading towards 4 billion, so there's been significant gains there. And most notably, as referenced, we have the surge, and largely unexplained surge, in corporation tax, which goes beyond anything that could be explained by sort of historical norms, the performance of the economy, or international comparisons. And our estimate is that this excess corporation tax could be anywhere from 2 to 6 billion. Now that's not suggesting that this money would evaporate, it's just trying to say, well, how much of the increase in recent years goes beyond those metrics, and it could be anything from 2 to 6 billion. So adding the lower unemployment spending, the higher cyclical revenues, the lower interest, and the boost from corporation tax, you're possibly getting a gain of between 10 and 14 billion, above and beyond what you might typically expect. So a strongly performing economy, historically low interest rates, and largely unexplained surge in corporation tax have got us this boost of 10 to 14 billion. But over the same period, the change in the overall balance has been around 3 billion. So these were largely unexpected. These weren't being predicted, but the balance hasn't improved to the same extent that these have come in. The improvement has just been around 3 billion. So these gains on the revenue and spending side have been used on the policy side. And with corporation tax, like what would suggest that there's an excess out there, well, corporation tax has never comprised a greater share of exchequer tax revenue. So for 2018, it's heading for 18.7%. The 2019 figure suggests a bit of a decrease, but November has yet to come. It'll be maybe Tuesday next week when we get the November exchequer returns. We'll see what the outcome is being for 2019, but the 10.4 billion collected in 2018, that was a record in terms of reliance on corporation tax, and that reliance is exacerbated by the fact that those monies are being used and not being set aside, even though there is questions about their sustainability. On the spending side, one issue we've had is that many of the increases have been unplanned. We were assessing budgets, assessing stability program updates, and then as you get towards the end of the year, the figures change. And most notably this has happened in relation to health, with ongoing and significant overruns on an annual basis. So we've explored these in a bit more detail in this report as to what might be driving or causing them, and the different sources of them. So just in overall terms, looking at allocated and final spending to health. So in each year since 2016, we've seen the allocation to health increasing. But again, in each year then, the actual increase goes beyond that. So you have an unplanned increase on top of the planned increase. So for 2018, this reached around 700 million, so quite a large increase. For 2019, the planned increase was 1.1 billion. So there was a large initial additional allocation given to health, and even still, we have a supplementary estimate going through the Oireachtas for 335 million. So the increase for 2019 will be even greater again. For 2020, we now look like we're going to have the largest planned increase for the data we have here, an increase of almost 1.2 billion. But again, because of these repeated patterns of overruns on an annual basis, it would raise some concerns about the 2020 figure, that if there's to be an overrun again, would add further to the growth, not just in health spending, but in spending across the economy as a whole, given that much of this is linked to current spending and employment. In the budget and the Brexit scenario, it was set on the basis of a hard Brexit, and we only got one set of fiscal forecasts. So the government indicated what the economic outcome might be in an orderly versus disorderly outcome. And when it came to the fiscal numbers, we only got them on a hard Brexit basis. So again, when looking at what's included in the budget, we have to consider that the context, the uncertainty, and the fact then that the fiscal forecasts were on the assumed basis of a hard Brexit. And looking at the impact that has on the numbers for 2020, various things that the government was intending to do in response to a hard Brexit. Now, some of it will happen automatically, so you would get a slowdown in the Irish economy. So unemployment will be higher than forecast. Not necessarily saying that there'll be an outright loss in employment and a big jump in unemployment, but compared to the deal scenario, unemployment would be higher. So there would be higher employment supports. So unemployment related spending would be higher, and that's not really a policy decision. And from our perspective, that increase in unemployment related spending is something that would happen given the changes in the economy, and it wouldn't necessarily be due to policy. But if you look at some of the other issues, most notably have in pink here the sectoral supports. So a hard Brexit could potentially have a very negative impact on those sectors that maybe are trading most closely with the UK. So the government announced a package of around 650 million of proposed sectoral supports. Didn't tell us what they were, but kind of set out broad areas in which that support might be offered. And one thing we know in the figures is that these are not expected to continue. These supports in the figures are only included for 2020. So this suggests that they would be one-off, and if they were to be one-off, they wouldn't impact on the assessment of the fiscal stance or the rules assessment, which would exclude those, but not ongoing or issues that arise on an annual basis. But of course, from our perspective, it's crucial if they were to be introduced, would they be one-off? If you are going to grant support to particular sectors, it's very difficult then to take those back. When it comes to the employment supports, the forecast of unemployment is higher for all years, and then you get that higher unemployment spending. And then because of the hard Brexit scenario, the issues with the border, compliance checks, collection of customs duties, the government will incur certain costs. So over the short run, there'll be capital costs, maybe at ports and the border, and then there'll be ongoing compliance costs, which by and large will be staff to deal with, and the various checks that would have to be introduced in the event of a hard Brexit emerging. So these are included in the figures, but are very much based and dependent on the assumption of a hard Brexit. So the unemployment support is something that happens naturally, and we would account for that in terms of our cyclical adjustment within our assessment of the fiscal stance. And the sectoral supports in the figures are one-off, but whether that was to happen if they were introduced remains to be seen. So if you look at what the government have done for 2020, and where does it lie in terms of our advice before the budget, and what we assess in terms of their overall stats. So if you look at what they had in April's SPU, the Stability Programme update, and that fed through into the summer economic statement. When it came to net policy spending, so looking at both the revenue and the expenditure side, their plans initially set out indicated a rise of around 3.1%. So that the increase in spending and the adjustment of the tax side suggested that net policy spending would grow by 3.1%. We assessed that in our pre-budget statement, and our advice was pretty simple: stick to the plans. We weren't looking for anything additional. In fact, over recent years, what the Fiscal Council has been looking for, by and large, has been for the government to deliver on the plans that have set out. So for 2020, they set out a plan where net policy spending would grow at 3.1%. When it came to the actual assessment, we looked at, well, what could be sustainable. So while it would be good to deliver on that plan, if we take the performance of the economy, the potential growth rate, and also the assumption of forecast inflation for next year, it would imply or suggest a sustainable limit in sort of neutral or normal times of around 4.5%. So the government in their plans were below that, and there was important justifications for why that would be the case. Yes, you had the risk of a hard Brexit. Yes, you had the reliance on excess corporation tax receipts. You had the rapid growth in spending, as we saw up to 2018. You had perhaps the risk of overheating within the Irish economy, and just the general risks in the international trade environment. So although that might imply, or the growth rates and inflation might imply a sustainable limit of 4.5%, there was good reasons for sticking to the government's original plan of an increase of 3.1%. What did they do? Well, they got right to the limit of what would be considered sustainable. So the budget itself delivered an increase in net policy spending of around 4.4%. So close to the limit of what could be considered sustainable, and maybe not particularly taking on the number of risks outlined there. When it came to the Brexit contingency, if that was to happen, and if it was to be included, the increase would be 5.6%. Now that would require some of those once-off issues to be repeated, so that assessment would be happen subsequently. But if the Brexit contingency is as set out, the 4.4 number is the one to assess. Like if they are once-off, they wouldn't be on an ongoing basis and not policy over the medium term. So the plans originally set out were net policy spending of 3.1%, and what was delivered on budget day was an increase of 4.4%. So close to the limit of what's sustainable, and maybe not fully taking into account the risks we face, and leaving the public finances in a weaker position than might otherwise be the case. So looking to see then, why did that increase happen? And this leads us to other concerns we have. So looking at this in numbers terms, so the previous chart was looking at it in percentage terms. If you just look at the numbers terms, so our assessment of the plans the government set out was that they incorporated an increase in policy spending of 2.5 billion. So from April and through the summary economic statement, you're looking at an increase of 2.5 billion, and then we get changes in the delivery and the plan actually set out that lead to that increase. So one increase was that exchequer spending was higher than originally intended. So the government had 1.2 billion of higher exchequer spending in the budget than they had in their earlier plans. Now part of that is due to a timing issue that we could reflect here and say that this figure was 2.7, but 2020 is due to have 53 payment dates, and that's something that happens very irregularly and doesn't have a long-term impact on the public finances, just due to the calendar, the number of days in a year. So 2020 is one of the years in, I think every 5 or 6, and where there is an additional payment date. So spending in 2020 will just be higher a small bit because of that additional payment. That should essentially be spread out over a number of years. So the reduction we're making is a reduction of about 0.2 billion, just because of that additional payment date in 2020 that affects the cash payments, but isn't something that happens on an ongoing basis. Now, although spending is higher, the government changed their tax plans. So they didn't have as large an income tax package as was assumed in the earlier documents, and introduced some tax increases. So although we have higher spending, a large share of it, in exchequer terms at least, was funded by changes on the revenue side. So if you just go as far as here, like some in these suggest that they stuck pretty close to plans, that you're probably getting from 2.5 to maybe 2.6. And in terms of the government's assessment of what they did, they said they had a plan for a package using their approach of 2.8 billion, and they introduced one that, again using their approach, was just under 3 billion. So in the approach they took, they were pretty close to plans. And if you take this here, the higher spending being funded by additional taxes, in an exchequer basis, it does look pretty close to plans. But of course, our assessment was, they said 3.1%, and actually ended up being 4.4. So there is something else happening, and something quite significant, and that is higher spending outside the exchequer. So other sectors of the government that are not directly funded from the exchequer account, and this spending is as important as exchequer spending, and is how we perform our assessment, not narrow on the exchequer, but looking at broader impact of changes that happen outside the exchequer, local authorities and LBC perhaps, other areas that aren't directly funded. And that meant that the increase in money terms goes from the planned 2.5 billion to an actual 3.5 billion. And if you were to include the Brexit contingency, it would go to 4.6. But again, given the information we have, our direct assessment has been the 2.5 billion set out in the Civility Programme update, and the 3.5 billion as delivered on budget day, with the reason for, perhaps the reason for the difference being that the higher non-exchequer spending. Now in general, we wouldn't even do this breakdown here. Like where the money comes from, it all has the same impact on the economy. So by and large, we try to avoid the distinction between exchequer and non-exchequer, and look at it in broader general government terms. But I think there's a number of reasons why making that distinction is important in this instance, and one of those is transparency. We know lots about what happens with the Exchequer. So there's a comprehensive expenditure report published with the budget that goes through lots of detailed line by line analysis of where the changes are happening. We know close to nothing about what happens outside the Exchequer. Like, why is there this additional 900 million of spending on the general government terms? Who is doing it? What agencies, what entities, what economic activities related? That information is not provided in the budget. So there's a concern that the increases outside the Exchequer impact the economy just as much as Exchequer or central government spending, and they should be fully incorporated in budget plans with details given of what they actually entail, and looking to see where the impact has. So our view is that the department needs to publish more information and comprehensive projections on a general government basis. So not the narrow focus on the Exchequer, but the broader impact of the government and the changes that can happen within different areas. And it is quite significant, although the attention does tend to be on the Exchequer, maybe for historical reasons and also maybe for reasons of data. You have the monthly Exchequer return. There is much more going on across the broad government sector. And if you look at it from the revenue perspective, Exchequer revenue is only 2/3 of total government revenue. A third of revenue doesn't come into the Exchequer account. Another large share of it is PRSI, which in your monthly report on the Exchequer, PRSI doesn't tend to get a significant amount of attention. It is in the Exchequer monitor, but you have to do a bit of work out to find out what the figure is. And PRSI receipts are heading for 11 billion. So they are a huge amount of government revenue, but because they don't appear in the direct Exchequer account, can get overlooked. And then you have another 20% of government revenue that's outside of sort of central government revenue, not in the Exchequer or in the Social Insurance Fund. And whether that is fees or charges, local government rents, taxes collected at a local level, commercial rates collected by local authorities, water charges collected by Irish Water, the television licence, and a whole range of things would go into other revenue sources. And that would bring the total up to the total of 100%. So the focus on the Exchequer can limit or exclude some of those. And the same happens then on the spending side. Exchequer or central government spending is about 80% of the total, taking into account allocations to departments from the Exchequer and also spending from the Social Insurance Fund. And then again around the fifth happens outside of it. So we have this in grey or close to grey, because by and large a lot of what happens there doesn't get the same attention and doesn't have the same information or details published on it. The CSO added up in aggregate, but can be hard to tell what's happening at an individual basis. And what we see happening here for 2020 is that the increase relative to what was in the April plans is happening in this position up here. So the government set out general government figures, and now the spending that appears to be here is close to $1 billion higher. So where is that happening? It's not included in the budget documents, but inquiries and concerns we've raised suggest it's happening through local government and also through the approved housing bodies. And it does appear to be an increase in capital spending that wasn't in the plan as set out in April. Now this type of spending isn't something we have an issue with. If there are to be additional resources allocated to social housing, the provision of housing through local authorities and the approved housing boards, that's entirely for the government to decide. But those issues should be included when it comes to the assessment of the budget package. So they were excluded in the government's assessment because they happened outside the Exchequer, but for the economy as a whole and for our assessment, they are included. And it's that which has pushed the potential growth rate of spending for 2019 or for 2020, close to the limit of what would be sustainable. And it is in sort of the overall aggregate figures, but no details have been provided in the budget documents, and there should be a greater level of transparency. And this is not something that just the Fiscal Council is saying. The OECD have recently issued a report on Ireland where there should be a move to more general government accounting. and move away from the focus on the exchequer. And it is to be welcomed that the government have said that they will incorporate the recommendation of the OECD report over the next 3 to 5 years. So hopefully we'll see movement in line with what has been suggested here. So just look at our key messages, our assessment. So there's been a failure to stick to plans in recent years, as said most notably in 2018, showing up in that significant breach of the spending rule based on our assessment for 2018, with much of that happening through unplanned increases. And for 2018, one notable thing was that the outturn reported by the CSO had about $500 million extra spending than the budget documents produced by the government in October. So 10 months through 2018, the government published their budget day documents, even though it was budget 2019, it actually was $500 million out for 2018. And we would have concerns about the 2019 figures. They kind of go in both directions. We're not sure whether the overall outturn will be higher or lower than the budget day forecast, but there are issues with transfer payments, intermediate consumption, and the capital spending figures on a general government basis in the budget, and that's for 2019. So we're sort of holding our assessment of 2019 until we see that the CSO figures, the figures as published by the department, are compliant and show a reduction in spending growth. And we will have concerns about what the CSO will show in April when the final figures are produced. But 2019 itself shows the government again failing to stick to its plans with the supplementary estimates in health, the continued non-allocation of funding for the Christmas bonus that only happens in October of each year. So for 2020, the government is going to have overruns. Well, in a very welcome step, the government have incorporated the 2019 overruns in their estimate of the budget package. So we do it in our approach. All the figures they are looking at, including the overruns for 2019. When I said the government estimated that their budget package is around $3 billion, that incorporates the overruns for 2019. So it's the increase relative to the plans they set out in April to what they now intend to do by the end of next year. So what happened in previous years is there'll be hundreds of millions of overruns in the current year. They were formally announced in the white paper at midnight on the Friday before the budget, and then on the Tuesday the government started from a clean slate as if those overruns hadn't happened. And as we said, the overruns are current spending, so they're ongoing, they're cumulative and they build up. But in a very welcome step for 2019, at least on an exchequer basis, the government incorporated the overruns for 2019 in their budget 2020 plans. So that means that the cost of those overruns is being reflected in the budget package. That's something the Council have been looking for a number of years, and it is a welcome step that the government chose to incorporate the overruns for 2019 in their assessment of the plans for 2020. However, the concern we have is that while it was a welcome step for the overruns, the way the government set out their budgetary plans didn't take into account the full impact of spending across the government sector. So large upward revisions to spending outside of the exchequer, so local government and housing bodies, push spending to the limit of what might be considered sustainable in 2020 and highlights the need for greater transparency. So we'd like to have these general government accounts published on a more comprehensive basis so that it's evident where the spending increases are happening. And of course the concern would be that because they've now gone to the limit of what's sustainable, recent history suggests that spending plans haven't been delivered on. So if there is to be slippage in 2020, there is potential that the spending plans could employ limits that go beyond sustainable or prudent levels if the plans as set out aren't adhered to, which has been the issue for recent years. As we said at the outset, debt remains high, and budget 2020 plans remove the safety margin that was planned for in April. So that 3.1% increase, increasing up to 4.4%. So it narrows the scope to cushion adverse shocks, so we should be running a larger surplus, something to absorb the negative impact that something like a hard Brexit might bring. It adds to activity in an already fast-growing economy. So we saw the unemployment rate dropping below 5%, with potential wage pressures emerging. If the government is stimulating a fast-growing economy, that could lead to further overheating pressures. And the rainy day fund contributions have also been postponed. So these are something that have been flagged for a number of years, but because of various issues and delays and a reduction of their size, they now won't happen until 2021, even though this was something that should have been in place to offset maybe the impact of a potential rainy day with one on the horizon, but no resources set aside to explicitly deal. So that's sort of a brief run through, 160, 170 pages of our November 2019 assessment.